but it's also about our that can only be fully achieved with statehood. Yesterday, I imposed a curfew at 7 p.m. 5 minutes before that curfew, we note, as many people around the country noted, that protesters in front of the White House were dispersed using some form of munitions. DC police throughout the night enforced a curfew, and last night, I think the chief will confirm this number, a number of people were arrested in violation of that protest. I want to ask the Chief of Police, Peter Newsham, to come up and describe our response last night, and then we can take a few questions.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser, and thank you again for your continued leadership in these very difficult times. I'm Peter Newsham. I'm the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Police Department. Last night marked our 4th day of demonstration activity here in Washington, D.C., related to the senseless death of George Floyd. Yesterday began with 2 separate groups at approximately 3 o'clock, one in Lafayette Square and the other in the vicinity of the U.S. Capitol. Both groups assembled peacefully at these locations. At around 6:30, the group at Lafayette Plaza was alerted by federal law enforcement officers who gave warnings for them to disperse. I had received prior to that, just before that, that there would be a presidential movement in the area. The Metropolitan Police Department did not participate in that movement. As you all know, there was a curfew that was initiated yesterday between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. The next incident of significance was at around 7:20 p.m. In the area of 17th and I Street. 54 persons were arrested, primarily for being in violation of the curfew. At around 9 p.m., in the vicinity of 9 p.m., there was a large group of protesters that was up in our northwest area of the city. In the 2400 block of 14th Street Northwest, we started to see behavior that was consistent with the behavior that preceded the very violent activity that we had on the 2 nights before. We actually had a Metropolitan Police Department that was set on fire. We were able to get that group stopped in the 1400 block of Swan Street Northwest, where we made a significant arrest of multiple folks who were in violation of the curfew. There was a homeowner in the block. There was a lot of Twitter activity, social media activity about this, and I know there will be questions that I can answer later, who allowed a number of the people who were going to be arrested into his home. Those people ultimately were not arrested. My understanding is Metropolitan Police Department officers were in constant communication with that homeowner throughout the evening. So just getting back to the area where the majority of the arrests were made, where we had 54 arrests down at 17th and I, 194 arrests in the area of Swan Street. Later on in the evening, we had another group of about 300 or so that was there in the area of the police or headquarters or Judiciary Square. During that instance, they were becoming very aggressive. Police officers had to utilize munitions to disperse that group. Ultimately, they were able to successfully disperse that group. The amount of damage that we had and the injury to police officers was significantly less than the prior 2 evenings. We had 2 officers injured. Those injuries were non-life-threatening where the officers were treated. We had the 1 police car that was set on fire. There are some properties across the city where there was some destruction of property, some glass damage, and I'm sure there was some destruction of property with regards to graffiti. At the end of the process, we had over 300 arrests. So we had the majority of the arrests were at those 2 locations, and we had several other arrests across the city. We will be giving specific details with regards to who was arrested as soon as we get that information. We'll get it out to you. The arrests were primarily for these 3 categories of offenses. Violation of the curfew was the majority of the arrests. We also had arrests for burglary, and we had arrests for rioting. I want to again mention the fact that we are working right now with our investigative team to compile images of anybody that was in our city over the past 3 or 4 nights who was involved in destruction of property or the throwing of missiles and the hurting of people. We will be releasing those images. We're going to ask the community to assist us with identifying those folks so that they can be held accountable. With that being said, we can take any questions, I believe, Mayor, that anyone has.
Do you know who gave the order to fire on those protesters last night?
What order are you talking about?
Somebody gave the officers in Lafayette Park the order to use munitions against peaceful protesters.
Are you talking about the presidential movement?
Yes.
The presidential movement was handled by federal resources. I was told of the movement. It was an unplanned movement shortly before it occurred. And the Metropolitan Police Department did not participate, so it would be out of turn for me to speak about who, what, where, and how munitions were deployed.
Do you have an opinion on the fact that those munitions were deployed against protesters?
I don't know the circumstances, so as I gather more detail, I may be able to develop an opinion on that.
Does the mayor, do you have a comment on what happened there last night, Mayor?
From what I could see, just like you all could see, I didn't see any provocation that would warrant the deployment of munitions, and especially for the purpose of moving the president across the street.
I know last night in a tweet you called it shameful. Rethink that overnight, maybe a stronger word, perhaps?
I said what I said. I stand behind it. Yep.
Chief, going back to, well, somebody define munitions and tell us exactly what type of munitions were deployed, either by your department or what you know was deployed during the movement.
So I can only talk for my department, and this is a very fluid activity. So anytime we deploy munitions, our police officers are required to report that, and we investigate that. Our Internal Affairs Division will go back and they will investigate every deployment that we had. What we had used last night, and the time that I can't say that we didn't use pepper spray at other points, because when you're making arrests of that nature, if anybody rushes the line, an officer may utilize pepper spray to control that line. But the only incident in which
All right, we're going to step away from the mayor and the police chief right now. We'll get you caught up on what they are talking about in a few minutes, but we want to head up to Northeast D.C., about 4 miles away from where the mayor and the police chief are right now. This is the motorcade that is arriving outside of on the way to the National Shrine. These protesters are actually right across from the Basilica, adjacent to Catholic University. You can see in the background, there is the president's motorcade that is going by. As you can hear protesters cheering. There's the beast with President Trump inside. And you can hear a chorus of boos from the protesters. Those are D.C. police officers that are standing in between those protesters and the motorcade. This is as close as they would allow protesters to get. And of course, outside of the National Shrine there, it is a very residential area. The protesters essentially on public property. They did talk with police to make sure that they would be able to stay there. As you see in the background, the motorcade and some of the motorcade vehicles, the press vans, etc., continuing to roll by there in the area of the National Shrine. Once they turn the corner and they head out of sight there, you'll see there's the Basilica, and to the left on that street they turn down. If you go down that street just a short ways and make another left turn, that's where the National Shrine is, what used to be the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center. That is where the President and First Lady will be in just a short amount of time. We understand that they will be laying a wreath there and spending a few moments inside in honor of Pope John Paul II's 100th birthday. Now, his actual birthday was several months ago, so I'm not quite sure why this specific date was chosen. The announcement from the White House came out last night as to the schedule, but you can see some of the protesters who are there outside of that area. Our Bob Barnard is there right now. Bob, if you can hear us, I'd love to hear from some of the protesters as far as what they are saying right now.
Absolutely. And Steve, these folks said that they are residents of the Brookland area, and they were upset that they were being told that, first of all, they can't go to Mary's Shrine, which is the shrine that everybody's familiar with, which is where we are across the street from it, that it's closed today. And then they also were saying that they should be able to be right here on the street next to folks. And the police at one point, D.C. police about 45 minutes ago, tried to push these people further away, and they protested, and you see the young families that are here. And D.C. police, since they were the ones telling the folks to move back, acquiesced and said, you can stay here. There has been a statement put out by the Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Gregory. He said he finds it reprehensible and baffling that any Catholic facility would allow the president, who last night, as we heard Chief Newsham mentioning and Paul Wagner asking, unleashed munitions and tear gas on peaceful protesters just so the president yesterday could walk out of the White House across Lafayette Park and to St. John's Episcopal Church for a photo op. So Wilton Gregory, the Archbishop of Washington, who really doesn't have control over the St. Pope John Paul II National Shrine, which is what that is now called down the street here, next to Mary's Shrine. The shrine most people are familiar with is the shrine to the Virgin Mary. Wilton Gregory said that he found it reprehensible and baffling that facility, the John Paul II Shrine, would be used to host the president for something like he's going there today, this wreath laying. John Paul's birthday was in May last month. He died in April, so there's really no anniversary to this wreath laying today involving the former Pope. But I gather the Archbishop had no control over who uses that facility or the decision-making by the folks at the John Paul II Shrine to allow the President and First Lady, hours after he unleashed tear gas on peaceful protesters, to come there and in a sense, make a statement today. So some friction within the Catholic Church community here. These protesters are on the grounds of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is across the street from Mary's Shrine. And you've got a lot of folks here who are obviously